The man didn't even look at her face when he took the baby. He just reached down into the blood-stained blanket, pulled the infant out with one hand like he was picking up something he'd left on a shelf, and walked toward the door. Elena Cross screamed so hard her stitches tore. She grabbed his coat sleeve with both hands, wet, shaking, barely able to sit upright. And he didn't slow down. He didn't even flinch. He just said, "You were bought to work, not to keep." And he kept walking. That was the moment Elena's world split in two. Everything before that door closed, and everything after. If you've ever held something precious and felt it taken right out of your hands, stay with me. Because this story is about what one woman did when the world told her she had no rights, no voice, and no future. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elena's story all the way to the end. Because what happens next will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Don't miss a single chapter. Let's begin. The storm had been building since noon. By the time Elena Cross delivered her daughter on the dirt floor of a storage shed outside the settlement of Coldwater Crossing, the rain was coming in sideways, and the single oil lamp on the shelf above her had flickered out twice. There was no midwife. There was no doctor. There was a woman named Hattie, 50 years old, missing 2 fingers on her left hand and sharp as a boning knife, who had helped dozens of women through labor in that shed and never once lost her nerve. Hattie talked Elena through the worst of it, hour after hour, her voice steady and low, one hand gripping Elena's wrist like an anchor. "You breathe," Hattie kept saying. "You breathe and you push, and you dare give up." Elena did not give up. At 3:40 in the morning on the 14th of October, in the middle of a lightning storm that knocked a pine tree across the road outside, the baby came into the world crying so hard that Hattie laughed out loud. A short, startled sound, like she hadn't expected joy to show up in a place like that. Elena held her daughter for 11 minutes. She counted them later. 11 minutes was all she was given. She named her Rose in those 11 minutes, whispering it against the baby's head, which was soft and warm and smelled like something she had no words for. Rose. It was her grandmother's name. Her grandmother had been a hard woman who kept a garden and never complained about anything except cold coffee and dishonest men. Elena had loved her more than anyone alive. She pressed her lips to Rose's forehead and said the name out loud 3 times, like she was planting it somewhere deep where no one could dig it out. Then Clyde Harker came through the door. He wasn't a large man, which surprised people who had only heard his name spoken in low, careful voices. He was maybe 5'9", with a thin face and pale eyes the color of old dishwater, and he wore his clothes like a man who wanted you to know they were expensive without him having to say so. He had a gold watch chain. He wore it every day. Elena had come to hate that watch chain more than she hated almost anything else in her life, because it swung when he moved, and it caught the light in a way that seemed designed to remind you that he had things and you did not. He looked at the baby. He didn't look at Elena. "Good," he said. He said it the way a man says good when the coffee is the right temperature. Mild, satisfied, completely indifferent to the cost of the thing. Hattie stepped between him and Elena. She was still holding a damp cloth in her hand, and she didn't put it down. "She just delivered, Clyde. You leave these 2 alone tonight." "I'm not talking to you, Harriet." "I know you're not. I'm talking to you." He looked at her for a moment, long enough to make a point, and then he stepped around her like she was furniture. He reached down. He took Rose. Elena's body reacted before her mind did. She grabbed his coat with both hands, the fabric bunching in her fists, and she yanked hard enough that he stumbled sideways half a step. The baby started crying again at the sudden movement, and the sound of it was like a hook in Elena's chest being pulled tight. "Give her back," Elena said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her. "Give her back right now." Harker steadied himself. He looked down at her hands on his coat with an expression that wasn't exactly anger. It was something colder than anger, something that had been used so many times it had worn smooth. Contempt? Maybe. Or just complete disregard. "You were bought to work," he said, "not to keep." He walked to the door. Elena screamed. She screamed his name. She screamed for Hattie. She screamed for someone outside. And she felt something tear inside her, something physical, and she didn't care. She tried to stand and her legs folded under her, and Hattie caught her before she hit the floor, wrapping both arms around her and holding on even as Elena kept reaching for the door, kept trying to pull herself toward it, toward the sound of the baby's crying that was getting farther away in the rain. "Elena?" Hattie's voice was right against her ear, low and fierce. "Elena, stop! You'll bleed out! You stop right now!" "He took her." Elena couldn't say anything else. "He took her, Hattie." "I know." Hattie held her tighter. "I know he did." "He can't. She's mine. She's my daughter. I know." Hattie's voice cracked, just barely. She pressed her cheek against the side of Elena's head and held on. "I know, honey. I know." Outside, the storm kept coming. The pine tree across the road creaked in the wind. The oil lamp flickered. Elena stopped screaming eventually, not because the grief ran out, but because her body ran out of strength to carry it. She lay on the floor with her head in Hattie's lap, shaking without sound. And she stared at the closed door and she thought, very clearly, the way you sometimes think the clearest things in the worst moments, "I am going to find her. I don't know how, but I'm going to find her." She held on to that thought like Hattie had held her wrist, like an anchor. By morning, the storm had passed and Elena Cross was for sale. That was how Coldwater Crossing worked, at least in the years when Clyde Harker ran it. It wasn't a town, not exactly. It was a settlement, the kind of place that existed because it was 3 days' ride from the nearest place with actual laws. And in that gap between civilized places, all kinds of arrangements grew up that couldn't survive sunlight and a judge. Harker had arrived 6 years earlier with a land deed of questionable origin, and the kind of confidence that passes for authority when no one is willing to call it out. He'd built the trading post, the overnight house, the livestock pens. He'd started buying contracts on people, debt contracts, labor contracts, contracts that sounded like one thing in the language he used to sell them and turned out to be something else entirely in the language of what they actually required. People came through Coldwater Crossing headed west, headed north, headed anywhere that wasn't where they'd been. Some of them arrived already in debt. Some of them made deals they didn't fully understand because they were desperate, and Harker had a way of making desperate people feel like they were being helped. And once the contract was signed, getting out of it required money that most of them didn't have, and a lawyer they'd have to travel 4 days to find. Elena had been brought to Coldwater Crossing 8 months earlier under a labor contract she'd signed in a moment of genuine desperation. Her husband dead of a fever, her family scattered, no money and no options, and a man in a wagon who told her he had work in the Northwest Territory, honest work, good wages, a place to sleep. The contract she'd signed had been 6 pages long, and she'd read every word of it because she wasn't stupid and she wasn't careless. What she hadn't known was that 3 of those pages had been switched out between the time she read them and the time she signed, something she only discovered weeks later when she asked to see the contract again, and the version Harker showed her was not the one she remembered. By then it was too late. By then she was already pregnant, alone, and 4 days from the nearest town with nothing but the clothes she'd arrived in. She had tried to run once, in her 5th month, when she still thought she could move fast enough. Harker's man had caught her 6 miles out and brought her back without violence. That was the thing about Harker. He rarely used direct violence when he could use the appearance of reasonableness instead. And Harker had sat across from her in his office and spoken to her very calmly about the terms of her contract and the financial penalties for abandonment and how those penalties had now significantly increased her debt, which meant she now owed him considerably more time and labor than she had before she ran. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he'd told her, leaning back in his chair, watching her with those pale eyes. "That's not in my interest. You work, I provide. That's the arrangement. I keep my side. You keep yours." She had looked at him across the desk and thought, "You are a very precise kind of monster. Not wild, not volatile. Precise. Controlled. The kind that keeps good records." Now, the morning after the storm, she sat on a wooden crate outside the trading post while Harker's man, a thick-necked enforcer named Doss, who had small eyes and enormous hands, and who Elena privately suspected had been born without the part of the brain that processes other people as fully human, kept one hand on her shoulder like she might bolt. Her body still ached from the delivery. She was wearing a borrowed dress over the shift she'd labored in. Her hair was still damp. There was a bruise forming along her left side from where she'd hit the ground when her legs gave out. She was trying very hard not to think about where Rose was at this exact moment. If she started thinking about that, she wouldn't be able to function, and she needed to function. She needed to be clear-eyed and present and paying attention because she had learned over the last 8 months that in this place, information was the closest thing to power a woman with nothing had. There were maybe 15 people gathered outside the trading post. Some were travelers passing through who had stopped to watch. Some were residents of the settlement, or whatever you called people who'd been stuck in Harker's orbit long enough to start thinking of it as home. A few of them knew Elena. The woman named Bia, who ran the overnight house laundry, caught Elena's eye from across the way and looked down immediately, jaw tight. She couldn't help. Elena knew that. Bia had her own contract and 2 children, and she couldn't help any more than Elena could help her. Harker stood in front of the group with his hands in his jacket pockets and his gold watch chain catching the thin morning light. He didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. He just said the number, the amount he'd accept to transfer Elena's contract to a new holder, and waited. The number was high enough to make a few people in the crowd shift their weight and murmur. High enough that Elena understood he wasn't primarily trying to get rid of her. He was making a point. He was showing what she cost, which was a way of showing what he owned. She stared at a fixed point on the ground in front of her feet and breathed and thought, Rose is somewhere in this settlement right now, or she was taken further. I need to know which. She heard Harker field 2 offers. She didn't look up to see who was making them. She heard Doss shift his weight behind her. She heard someone nearby cough. And then she heard a voice she didn't recognize. It was quiet. That was the first thing. In a crowd of people talking over each other, this voice was quiet and somehow still carried, the way a low note carries in a room better than a high one. I'll pay it, the voice said. The full amount. The crowd went still. Elena looked up. The man standing at the edge of the group was maybe 35, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men who spent most of their lives outdoors, because the sun and the wind worked on them in ways that made the usual markers unreliable. He was tall and wide through the shoulders, and he wore a heavy wool coat that had seen considerable use and a hat that had been rained on many times. He was not handsome in any dramatic way. He had a face that looked like it had been carved for function rather than appearance. Strong jaw, straight nose, dark eyes that were currently looking at Harker with an expression of calm, focused attention. He was holding nothing. He had no weapon visible. He just stood there with his hands at his sides and said the number again, the full number in exact figures, and pulled out a leather pouch and held it up. Harker looked at the pouch. He looked at the man. Something passed across Harker's face that Elena couldn't quite name, a flicker of irritation maybe, or calculation. Silas Boone, Harker said. His voice stayed pleasant. He was good at keeping his voice pleasant. I didn't know you were in the territory. Came down for supplies, the man said. Leaving today. And you want this woman's contract. I want to clear her debt. A pause. There's a difference. Harker smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been playing a game longer than anyone else in the room and knows it. Is there? Write it as a full release, Silas Boone said. Not a transfer. Release. The crowd stirred. A few people looked at each other. Elena felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, because she'd been too careful with hope for too long, but something that moved like hope, something that wanted to be hope if she'd let it. Harker looked at Boone for a long moment. Then he looked at the pouch. Then he smiled again, and this time it reached a little higher on his face. Full release, he said, for the price I named. That's what I said. Harker held out his hand for the pouch. Boone crossed the space between them and placed it there. Harker opened it, counted without hurry, and then reached into his jacket for a pen and a small folded paper. He kept papers on him always, another thing Elena had noticed, another thing she'd filed away. And he wrote something and signed it and held it out. Boone took it, read it fully, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. Then he turned and looked at Elena for the first time. His eyes were brown, she saw, dark brown, like river water in shade. "You want to come with me, or you want to stay here?" he asked. Just like that, like it was a genuine question with a genuine choice attached to it. Elena stood up, her legs held this time. "What do you want from me?" she asked, because she needed to know. She needed to know what the price really was, underneath the transaction. "Nothing," he said. "You don't owe me anything." She looked at him. He didn't look away. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't performing generosity or nobility or patience. He just stood there and waited. "I need to know where my daughter is," Elena said. Her voice cracked on the last word. She forced it flat again. "Before I go anywhere, I need to know." Something moved in Boone's face. Not pity. She would have hated pity. Something more like recognition. Like he understood what it meant to have a thing ripped away. "We'll find out," he said. "We'll ask, and we'll find out, and we'll know before we leave this place." She looked at Doss, who had removed his hand from her shoulder the moment the transaction completed and was now staring somewhere over her left ear like she no longer existed. She looked at the trading post where Harker had already turned away, already moving on to something else, already done with her. She thought of Rose's face. 11 minutes, the weight and the warmth and the smell. She picked up the small cloth bag that had all her belongings in it. A change of clothes, her grandmother's bone-handled comb, a piece of folded paper with her own handwriting on it from a letter she'd started and never finished, and she walked toward Silas Boone. "Ask fast," she said. "I want to be out of this place before dark." He nodded once, like that was exactly what he expected her to say. They got an answer within the hour. It wasn't a good answer. Rose had been sold before sunrise to a couple named Hadley, who were already 2 hours north on the river road, headed toward a settlement called Marin's Gulch, 5 days' ride away. The information came from a boy of about 14 who worked in the trading post stable and who told Boone in a low, fast voice with his eyes pointed at the ground, like he was confessing something. Elena listened. She kept her face still. She was very good at keeping her face still when she needed to. She committed every detail to memory. Hadley, River Road, Marin's Gulch, 5 days north. Then she picked up her bag and followed Silas Boone to his wagon. She didn't look back at Coldwater Crossing. There was nothing there she wanted to see again. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the pale morning sky, on the horizon that sat somewhere past the tree line with all its impossible, uncountable distance. Hadley, she thought, River Road, Marin's Gulch. She was already planning. The wagon ride north took the better part of 2 days before Silas turned west onto a dirt road that climbed through pine country and eventually opened onto a stretch of flat land bordered by a creek on one side and a line of old cottonwoods on the other. Elena had slept most of the first day, not because she felt safe, but because her body simply stopped cooperating somewhere around midday, and she woke up an hour later with her head against the side panel of the wagon and no memory of closing her eyes. She was furious with herself about that. She needed to be awake and paying attention, and instead her body had made the decision for her, the way bodies do when they've been pushed past what's reasonable. Silas hadn't commented on it. When she woke, he handed her a piece of dried meat and a canteen and kept his eyes on the road. That was something she noticed about him early. He didn't fill silence the way most people did. He didn't seem to feel the pressure of it. Most people, when they found themselves in a wagon with a woman who had just been through what Elena had been through, would say something, would try to explain themselves or offer comfort or ask questions. Silas drove the horses and let the silence sit there between them like it belonged. She wasn't sure yet if that was a virtue or if it meant he was hiding something. The ranch was smaller than she'd imagined from the way people in Coldwater Crossing said his name, like he was someone to be reckoned with, someone with weight and standing. The house was solid but plain. 2 rooms and a sleeping loft with a covered porch that ran the width of the front. There was a barn, a smokehouse, a garden that had clearly been tended by someone who knew what they were doing but had been neglected for a stretch of weeks. Fences in reasonable repair. 2 horses in the paddock and a dog of indeterminate breed who came off the porch at a trot and sniffed Elena's hand with professional thoroughness before apparently deciding she was acceptable. "What's the dog's name?" Elena asked. It was the first thing she'd said in several hours. Pot, Silas said. She looked at the dog and then at him. Pot. He gets into everything. He said it without any particular expression, but there was something underneath it, not quite a smile, just the shadow of one. There's a room in the loft. You can use it long as you need. She followed him inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something faintly herbal she couldn't identify. There was a bookshelf on the back wall with more books than she expected, maybe 40, maybe more, crammed in without any particular order, and a table with 4 chairs, which struck her because he clearly lived alone, and 4 chairs meant he'd once expected or hoped for more people than were currently here. She didn't ask about that. Not yet. He showed her the loft, which had a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the cottonwoods, and he showed her where the water pump was and where he kept the medical supplies. A wooden box under the kitchen shelf that had bandaging and a bottle of carbolic and several things she recognized, and a few she didn't. You should have someone look at you, he said. There's a woman named Marta Dean 2 hours east. She's good. Better than most doctors I've met. I'm fine. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who knows someone is not fine, but understands that arguing about it will accomplish nothing. All right, he said. When you decide you're not, I'll take you. She put her bag down on the bed in the loft and stood at the window and looked at the cottonwoods for a long time. Somewhere north of here, 5 days on the river road, a couple named Hadley was living in a settlement called Marin's Gulch with a baby girl they'd bought before sunrise in the middle of a rainstorm. Elena pressed her hand flat against the glass of the window and felt the cold coming through it. 5 days, she thought. I need to be strong enough in 5 days. She wasn't strong enough in 5 days. That was the first thing that went wrong with her plan. Not catastrophically, not in a dramatic way, just in the ordinary way that bodies don't recover on the schedule your desperation sets for them. The tearing she'd felt when she grabbed Harker's coat had done real damage, and by the 3rd morning on the ranch, she woke up with a fever that made the room tilt sideways when she tried to sit up. Silas brought Marta Dean without asking permission, which Elena was furious about right up until the moment Marta walked through the door and Elena saw her face, a round, no-nonsense face that had been weathered by decades of practical living, and heard her say, "Well, you're a mess, aren't you? Let's sort it out." Marta worked efficiently and without commentary on Elena's condition beyond what was medically relevant, which Elena appreciated more than she could say. She cleaned the wound, which had started to show early signs of infection, applied something that smelled strongly of camphor and stung considerably, and issued instructions in a tone that made it clear they were not suggestions. 2 weeks of rest, Marta said, at minimum. You can start moving around properly after that, but nothing strenuous and nothing stupid. I need to travel north, Elena said. 5 days on the river road. Not in 2 weeks, you don't. My daughter is... I know. Marta's voice softened, just slightly. She'd already gotten the short version of the story from Silas. Elena had overheard fragments of it through the floor. And she'll still be there in 3 weeks. A baby girl with a roof over her head is safer than her mother dead on the road. You understand me? Elena understood. She hated it, but she understood. She lay in the loft bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through everything she knew about the Hadleys, the same way she used to run through her multiplication tables as a child. Methodically, obsessively, trying to make something solid out of very little. A couple. Headed north. Marin's Gulch. She didn't know their first names. She didn't know what they looked like. She didn't know why they'd wanted a baby girl badly enough to buy one in the middle of a storm before dawn, though she had ideas about that, and most of them were the kind that kept her awake at night. She made herself stop. She focused on what she could control. She rested because Marta said to rest. She ate, even when she wasn't hungry, because she needed to be strong. She watched everything. Silas, she discovered, ran his ranch with the quiet discipline of a man who had learned to rely entirely on himself and had made a kind of peace with that. He was up before light. He fed the horses, checked the fences, worked on whatever needed working on. He cooked, simply, without any apparent enthusiasm for it, the way some people cook because they have to eat and not because they find any pleasure in the process. He brought food up to the loft without making a production of it, and left it on the small table by the window and went back downstairs. On the fifth evening, she came down on her own for the first time since the fever. She moved carefully, one hand on the ladder rail, taking it one step at a time. Silas was at the table with a spread of papers in front of him, maps, it looked like, and some kind of ledger. And he glanced up when she reached the bottom of the ladder. "You should be in bed," he said. "I've been in bed for 5 days," she said. "I'm losing my mind." He considered this for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from him. She sat down. She looked at the papers. They were maps, yes, hand-drawn in some cases, printed in others, of the territory north. She recognized the river road on one of them. Her eyes found it immediately and traced it upward toward the area where Marin's Gulch would be. "You've been looking into it," she said. "Trying to." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct, unperformed attention that she was starting to understand was just how he looked at things. Not warm exactly, not cold, just present. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to think about how to answer that. Not evasively. He didn't seem like an evasive man, but like he was trying to be precise. "Because it's wrong," he said finally. "What was done to you? What was done to her?" He paused. "And because I've seen Harker's contracts before. I know what they are." Something in his voice when he said the last part made her pay closer attention. "You have personal experience with him." It wasn't a question. He heard that. "My neighbor," he said. "Man named Croft. Had a piece of land east of mine, good land, ran it well for 15 years. Harker put a debt clause in a supply contract 2 years ago. Buried it 3 pages in, written in language nobody'd catch without a lawyer. Croft signed it. Lost his land inside of 8 months. He said it flatly, without anger in his voice, though she got the sense the anger was there somewhere. Banked down, controlled. Croft left the territory. His wife wouldn't leave without him. Their kids grew up without that land. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you were at Coldwater Crossing?" "Partly. I wanted to see what Harker's current operation looked like." "And what did you see?" He met her eyes. "You." She held his gaze. The lamp on the table put out a yellow light that caught the edges of the maps and made the shadows behind him deep. She was trying to figure out what category to put him in, what kind of person he was, what he wanted, what he was capable of. And she kept running into the problem that he didn't seem to fit the categories she had available. "I'm going to need your help getting to Marin's Gulch," she said. "I can pay you back over time. I'll work for it. You don't owe me anything," he said. The same words as before, the same tone. Not impatient, not performing patience either. "I know that's what you said." She leaned forward slightly. "But I need to understand the terms. Because the last time a man offered me help, the terms were in the fine print and I didn't find them until it was too late." He nodded slowly, like he understood why she was asking and didn't take offense at it. "No terms," he said. "No fine print. You want to leave tomorrow? We leave tomorrow. You want to leave in 3 weeks? We leave in 3 weeks. You want to go alone? I'll give you a horse and supplies and the best maps I have." He picked up his coffee cup, looked into it, put it down again. "I'm not Harker. I'm not going to pretend I can prove that to you right now, but that's the truth of it." She sat with that for a moment. 3 weeks, she said. "Marta said 3 weeks. 3 weeks, then." She pulled one of the maps toward her and looked at the river road, and for the first time since Coldwater Crossing, she let herself think beyond the immediate moment. Let herself think about what came after arriving in Marin's Gulch, after finding the Hadleys, after finding Rose, what she would say, what she would do if they refused, what legal standing she had, which was a question she didn't know the answer to and which frightened her in a specific practical way that she needed to solve. "The release paper Harker signed," she said. "Does it cover the baby?" Silas's expression shifted. "Just slightly, just enough." "No," he said. She had expected that. She'd suspected it the moment Boone took it from Harker's hand, the moment she saw Harker smile that particular smile. Of course it didn't. Harker would have been careful. Harker was always careful. The release was for Elena's contract only. Rose had been sold separately, which in Harker's legal framework made her a separate transaction entirely, and the Hadleys had a receipt, or something that functioned as one, which in the absence of any real legal authority in this part of the territory meant they had something closer to a claim than Elena did. "I need to find a lawyer," she said. "Nearest one is in Garnet Falls, 4 days southeast. Can we go before Marin's Gulch?" He looked at her across the table. She could see him doing the calculation. Her recovery, the distances, the weather this time of year, what a lawyer in Garnet Falls could realistically do in this situation. She was doing the same calculation and arriving at the same complicated answer. "We can try," he said. That night she lay in the loft and listened to the creek and thought about Harker. She thought about his pale eyes and his gold watch chain and the way he'd reached for Rose like she was something he'd left on a shelf. She thought about Croft, whose name she'd just learned, and his wife, and their kids, and the land they'd lost. She thought about how Harker never did anything dramatic or violent if he could accomplish the same end with a piece of paper. And then she thought something that surprised her with its clarity, something that cut through the grief and the fever residue and the exhaustion like a knife through cloth. It's not just me. It was never just me. There are others. She sat up in the dark and stared at the window. If Harker had done this to Croft, he'd done it to others. The contracts, the buried clauses, the fraudulent modifications. You didn't build that machine for one or two people. You built it because it worked repeatedly, which meant somewhere in this territory there were other people who had lost things to Clyde Harker and had no idea that anyone else had the same story, because Harker counted on people being isolated, on each person believing their situation was singular and private and shameful in some way. She needed to find those people. Not yet. Rose first, but after, or maybe alongside, but she needed to find those people. She lay back down. Her side ached. The creek ran outside. Pot, the dog, had somehow gotten into the house and was audible downstairs, his nails clicking on the floor as he made his rounds. She slept, and when she dreamed of her grandmother's garden. The smell of it in summer, the sound of bees, her grandmother's hands moving through the green. The 3 weeks passed the way time passes when you're waiting for something and trying not to measure it too closely. Elena got stronger. She started waking early and sitting on the porch with coffee, watching the light come up over the cottonwoods. She started helping with small things around the ranch, mending harness leather, tending the garden, which she found she was good at in the same uncomplicated way her grandmother had been. Silas didn't ask her to do any of it and didn't comment when she did. That suited her. They talked, gradually. Not about the important things at first, about practical things, about the territory, about the ranch. She asked about the books on the shelf, and he talked about them in a way that told her he'd actually read them, that they weren't decorative. She mentioned that she'd wanted to be a school teacher once, before everything, and he didn't react to that with the usual slightly condescending surprise she'd learned to expect from men when she said she had ambitions. He just nodded and said, "You'd be good at it." She wasn't sure why that mattered, but it did. On the 14th day, she came back from the garden to find a man she didn't recognize sitting at the kitchen table with Silas. He was older, maybe 60, with a beard going gray and the posture of a man carrying something heavy for a long time. His name was Elbert Pruitt, she learned when Silas introduced them, and he'd ridden 2 days from a settlement to the east called Dry Fork. He'd heard Silas had been asking questions about Clyde Harker. "My wife and I had a supply contract with him," Pruitt said. He held his hat in his hands and turned it, slowly, around and around. "Signed it 4 years ago. Everything seemed straightforward." He paused. "By the second year, we owed him more than the contract amount. I don't know how. I've gone over the papers 100 times, and I don't—" He stopped again, his hand stilled on the hat. "We lost the land this spring, everything my father built." Elena sat down across from him. "Do you still have the contract?" she asked. He looked at her, a quick, measuring look, and then he reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers held together with a piece of twine and put them on the table between them. She opened them and started reading. It took her about 10 minutes to find it. It was on page 4, in the middle of a paragraph about payment terms, written in language that sounded reasonable if you were reading quickly, but which, if you stopped and parsed every word, contained a compound interest clause that activated under conditions that were practically guaranteed to occur and which could, Over 2 years, multiply the original debt by a factor of 3. The language was almost identical to something she remembered from her own contract. Almost, but with small differences. Adapted, refined. She looked up at Pruitt. How many people at Dry Fork have contracts with Harker? At least 9 that I know of, Pruitt said. Probably more. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with that steady, attentive expression. I need to see all of those contracts, she said. Elena, I know. She held up one hand. Rose first, I know, but I need to see them before we leave. And I need the names of anyone else who's had dealings with Harker that didn't go the way they expected. She looked at Pruitt. Can you get me those names? Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the hat in his hands. Then he looked back at her with something in his face that was somewhere between surprise and, she thought, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long and has just been told he doesn't have to. Yes, he said, I can get them. The day before they were meant to leave for Garnet Falls, Silas came back from checking the east fence line with his jaw set in a way she'd learned meant something was wrong. She was on the porch with Pruitt's contracts spread across the boards in front of her. Pruitt had been back twice now, each time with more documents, and Elena had been reading them with methodical, consuming focus, and she looked up when she heard his horse. Riders came through the east side, he said. He dismounted without rushing. 3 of them. They weren't checking on anything. They were looking at the property lines. She felt the cold that wasn't weather. Harker's men. One of them I recognized from Coldwater Crossing. Big man, had a scar across his chin. Doss. The description matched Doss perfectly. She gathered the contracts carefully and straightened them into a pile. Her hands were steady. She was finding, with some grim interest, that fear and clarity could coexist in her, that the fear made the thinking sharper rather than muddying it. He's reminding us he knows where we are, she said. That's my read. How long before he does something more than look? Silas tied the horse to the porch rail and came up the steps and leaned against the post, looking out at the tree line. Depends on what he thinks he can still claim legally. If the release paper holds, he doesn't have grounds to take you, but he might decide grounds aren't the point. He doesn't like losing things, Elena said, even things he's already sold. No, he doesn't. She looked at the stack of contracts. These papers, she said, if I could get them to a lawyer, a real one, someone with standing in the territorial court, and if I could get the people who signed them to testify, that's a big undertaking. I know it is. Some of those people are terrified of him. I know that too. She met his eyes. But some of them are also angry, and anger is more durable than fear if you give it somewhere to go. She paused. I was terrified of him for 8 months, and then he took my daughter, and I stopped being terrified and started being something else. Silas looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something layered, something that had history in it she didn't know yet. You've thought about this for a while, he said. I think about it every night. She stood up and picked up the stack of contracts. I'm going to get my daughter back. That's the first thing, and it doesn't move. But while I'm doing that, I'm also going to build something that will make sure Harker can't do this to anyone else. She held his gaze. Are you with me on that? The question hung between them in the afternoon light. Out by the cottonwoods, a bird called once and went quiet. Pot appeared from around the side of the house and sat down at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at both of them with the interested expression of an animal who understood that something important was happening, even if the specifics were unclear. Silas looked at the tree line for another moment. Then he looked at her. Yeah, he said. I'm with you. She nodded once. She went inside to pack for the morning. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, because it had happened that same afternoon while she was on the porch reading Pruitt's contracts, was that Clyde Harker was at that moment sitting in the trading post at Coldwater Crossing with a man named Orrin Fell, who was a lawyer of the flexible sort, the kind who understood that the law in frontier territories was largely a matter of who had the most paper and the most patience, and that Harker had more of both than anyone in the region. Fell was looking at a document Harker had placed on the table between them, a document with Elena's name on it, and he was nodding slowly. The release Boone got is real, Fell said. I can't touch that. I'm not interested in the release, Harker said. I'm interested in the question of whether a woman who is no longer under contract can be considered a material witness in a debt dispute, which she can, under Territorial Statute 47. He picked up his coffee. And witnesses can be compelled to appear. Bell looked at him. That's a considerable stretch. Everything I've built is a considerable stretch, Harker said pleasantly. That's what stretches are for. He drank his coffee and watched the rain beginning outside the window. And he thought about Silas Boone's ranch and the east fence line and the woman who had grabbed his coat with both hands the morning after giving birth, like she had any right to hold on to something he'd already decided to take. He would need to move carefully. He always moved carefully. But he would move. They left for Garnet Falls at first light, with the contracts wrapped in oilcloth and packed at the bottom of Elena's bag where they'd stay dry if the weather turned. Silas had loaded the wagon the night before without making a ceremony of it. Food for 4 days, extra blankets, a rifle under the seatboard, and a pistol in his coat that Elena pretended not to notice, even though she noticed everything. Pot tried to follow them down the road, and Silas had to stop twice and turn him back before the dog finally gave up and sat in the middle of the track watching them go with an expression of personal betrayal. Elena had been awake since 2 a.m, not from pain. Her side was healing. Marta had said so on a final visit the day before, but from the specific kind of sleeplessness that comes from running the same set of problems through your mind on a loop and arriving at the same incomplete answers every time. She'd read Pruitt's contracts again. She'd read her own release paper again, looking for the edges of what it covered and what it didn't. She'd made a list in her head of every name Pruitt had given her, every person at Dry Fork, and the surrounding settlements who had a story that rhymed with hers. Sitting in the wagon as the ranch disappeared behind them and the road opened up through the pine country, she felt the shape of what she was trying to do settle into something more concrete. Not a feeling, something more like a structure, a plan with actual bones in it. Tell me about the territorial court, she said to Silas. How does it actually work out here? He was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when he was thinking rather than avoiding. Judge comes through Garnet Falls 4 times a year. Next session is 6 weeks out. There's a territorial prosecutor, a man named Wills, who mostly handles land disputes and contract fraud. He glanced at her. Whether he'd take something like this seriously depends on how much evidence you walk in with, and how many people are willing to put their names to it. How much evidence is enough? More than you currently have, he said, which was honest. She appreciated that he didn't soften it. The contracts Pruitt brought me, the compound interest clause is nearly identical across all of them. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. She watched the tree line passing. A pattern is evidence of intent, and intent changes what Harker can be charged with. Contract fraud is one thing. What he did to you and Rose is something else. I know. That's why I need both. I need the fraud charges to get the court's attention and the authority, and I need the rest to make them understand what kind of man they're actually dealing with. She paused. The lawyer in Garnet Falls. Do you know him personally? Her, Silas said. Adelaide Marsh. I knew her husband. He died 3 years ago and she took over his practice. She's better at it than he was. Elena filed that away. A woman who had inherited a man's work and made it her own in territory where that couldn't have been easy. That was someone who would understand things without needing them, explained. They stopped at midday by a creek crossing, watered the horses, ate without much conversation. Elena was reorganizing the contracts in her head, building an order of presentation, thinking about what Adelaide Marsh would need to see first to understand the scope of what Harker had constructed. She caught herself doing it the way she used to prepare lesson plans, back when teaching was still something she thought about as a future rather than a past. You start with what the person already understands, and you build toward what they don't. You never lead with the most complicated thing. Silas was watching the creek. After a while, he said, without turning around, "There's something I should tell you before we get to Garnet Falls." She looked at him. Adelaide Marsh isn't the only person in that town who knows Harker's name. He has a business arrangement with a man named Colton Drew, who runs the land registry there. Drew is the one who processed the title transfer on Croft's property. I don't know how deep that goes, but I know it's there. Elena absorbed that. So Harker has someone inside the registry. Possibly, maybe more than one person. Which means any records we try to file could be flagged. Or lost, Silas said. Or modified. She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran over its stones with a sound like something being sorted. Does Adelaide Marsh know about Drew? I don't know what she knows. Then that's the first thing we find out, Elena said. Before we show her anything. Before we tell her anything specific. We find out where she stands on Drew and on Harker, and we make our decision from there. Silas turned and looked at her with that expression she was getting to know. The one that meant he was recalibrating something, adjusting his understanding of her by some degree. She'd seen it the first time when she'd asked him about the contracts on the porch. She was starting to understand that he'd expected her to be someone he needed to help in a different way, someone who needed to be guided and managed and protected, and that he was finding this was not that. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about being recalibrated, but she liked that he was honest enough to let it show on his face. They reached Garnet Falls on the third day, late afternoon, when the light was going orange and low over the flat rooftops of a town that was larger than Coldwater Crossing, but still had the feeling of a place in the middle of becoming something, not quite arrived. Two main streets crossing, a courthouse building in pale brick that was the most permanent-looking structure in town, a scattering of businesses and houses spreading out in every direction with the irregular confidence of a place where people kept arriving and building without much planning. Adelaide Marsh's office was on the second floor of a building above a hardware concern. The stairs were steep, and the door at the top had a glass panel with her name painted on it in black letters that were slightly uneven, like whoever had done the lettering had started more carefully than they finished. Silas knocked. The woman who opened the door was somewhere in her late 40s, with gray coming through dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and ink on 3 of her fingers. She looked at Silas first, then at Elena, and then back at Silas. "Boone," she said. Not warm, not cold. Recognition. "Adelaide, this is Elena Cross." He paused a half beat. "We have a situation." Adelaide Marsh looked at Elena for a moment, with the particular attention of someone who has heard many situations and learned to gauge their actual weight before agreeing to carry them. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on, and then you'll tell me everything." Elena told her most of it. She left out some of the more personal parts, not strategically, but because she found she could only say certain things once, and she was saving them for when they would matter in a legal context. She told her about the contract, about the switched pages, about the compound interest clauses in Pruitt's documents, about the pattern across multiple contracts, about Rose. She put the contracts on Adelaide's desk one by one as she named them. Adelaide read with the focused speed of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She didn't interrupt. When she reached the third contract, she took her glasses off her forehead and put them on her face, which meant she was seeing something that required full attention. "These clauses," she said finally, setting the last contract down, "the language is too consistent to be accidental. I said the same thing. It would take a lawyer to write them this way. A careful one." Adelaide looked at the stack. "Harker doesn't have legal training. Someone is drafting these for him." "A man named Orrin Fell," Elena said. "He's based out of Coldwater Crossing." Adelaide's expression shifted by a fraction. "I know that name," she said carefully. "How?" "He filed a transfer of title through the Garnet Falls Registry about 14 months ago, property out of Dry Fork." She paused. "Colton Drew processed it." The silence that followed had weight to it. Elena watched Adelaide's face, and Adelaide watched the contracts, and Silas watched the window, which was dark now, the last light gone. "Are you aware of the connection between Drew and Harker?" Elena asked. Adelaide took her glasses off and set them on the desk. She folded her hands. "I became aware of something I couldn't prove about 18 months ago. I reported it to the territorial office and was told there was insufficient evidence to investigate." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that had been living there for a while. "I dropped it." "I shouldn't have dropped it." "You're picking it back up," Elena said. It wasn't quite a question. Adelaide looked at her directly. "You understand what you're asking me to take on. Harker has money and connections and a lawyer who apparently writes very good fraudulent contracts. The territorial court is 6 weeks out, and the judge who presides over it has a relationship with at least 2 men in this town who may be compromised. I understand all of that. And your daughter is 5 days north in Marin's Gulch, with a family that has a receipt of sale that, in the current legal vacuum, functions as something resembling ownership. Elena's jaw tightened. I understand that too. Then you understand that the legal path to getting her back requires us to first establish that the original transaction was fraudulent from the beginning, which requires proving the contract that bound you was forged, which requires the testimony of witnesses who may be frightened and in Harker's territory, which requires presenting evidence to a court that may itself be compromised. Adelaide looked at her steadily. That is a very long chain of requirements. Then we'd better start building it, Elena said. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. They worked until past midnight, the 3 of them around Adelaide's desk with the contract spread between them and a map of the territory pinned to the wall where Adelaide kept sticking small marks at every location with a documented Harker transaction. By the time they finished, there were 11 marks on the map, 11 separate locations, 11 separate transactions over 6 years that, taken together, described not a series of unfortunate business dealings, but a single coordinated system. He's systematic, Adelaide said, looking at the map. He targets people in transition, families moving through, people who've just lost something, people who need a contract fast and don't have time to have it reviewed. She tapped the map at Coldwater Crossing, and he chose his base of operations carefully, 3 days from any real legal authority. Long enough that by the time someone could get to a lawyer, the debt had compounded past the point of recovery. What do we do about Drew? Silas said. We go around him, Adelaide said. There's a secondary registry in Millhaven, 40 miles west. It's smaller, but it's clean. If we file there, Drew can't intercept the paperwork. She looked at Elena. But we need affidavits. Signed witness statements from the people Harker has wronged. Names and locations from your Pruitt contact. I have 11 names from Pruitt already, Elena said, and he said there were more. Get me 20 and I can build a case that no territorial judge can ignore regardless of who he knows, Adelaide said. Get me 30 and I can take it to the regional authority above the territory. Elena looked at the marks on the map. 11 dots of red ink, each one a family, a story, a piece of land or a contract or a life that Harker had dismantled with careful paperwork and patient timing. I can get you 30, she said. What came next was 3 weeks of writing that Elena would remember for the rest of her life, not as a clear sequence of events, but as a series of doorways. Standing at the door of a farmhouse in Dry Fork, while Pruitt made introductions, watching the face of a woman named Consolata Reyes shift from suspicion to something like painful recognition as Elena laid the contracts on her kitchen table. Standing at the door of a feed store in a settlement called Gray Hat, while the owner, a man named Birch, said he wouldn't sign anything and then spent 20 minutes explaining exactly why, and in doing so described the precise mechanism by which Harker had taken his supply contract and turned it into a lien on his building. Standing at the door of a one-room house where an elderly widow named Mrs. Plum had been living alone since her husband died, on land she didn't technically own anymore because a contract her husband had signed 4 years ago had transferred the deed under conditions neither of them had understood at the time. Elena sat with Mrs. Plum for 2 hours. She didn't rush her. She read the contract aloud in plain language, translating the legal phrasing into what it actually meant. And she watched Mrs. Plum's face move through confusion and then recognition and then something that sat between grief and fury in the particular way those two things occupy the same space when you finally understand you've been robbed. My husband thought he was protecting us, Mrs. Plum said quietly. He signed because he thought it was protecting us. I know, Elena said. He died thinking he'd done something wrong, that it was his fault. It wasn't, Elena said. None of it was his fault, and I'm going to make sure the court understands that. Mrs. Plum looked at her for a long moment, with eyes that had been through considerable weather. Then she reached out and took the pen Elena was holding and signed the affidavit at the bottom with a hand that was shaking slightly but did not stop. Elena had 23 signatures when the first real blow came. She and Silas had ridden back to his ranch after a long day in the field collecting statements, arriving after dark, and they'd found the south fence torn out across a 30-yard section, not fallen, torn, methodically pulled from its posts, and 2 of the 3 horses in the paddock gone. Pot was in the barn, which was unusual, and when Silas opened the barn door, the dog came out fast and went immediately to the tree line, hackles up, nose working. Silas stood at the broken fence in the dark and didn't say anything for a long moment. "How long ago?" Elena asked. "Couple hours, maybe less." He crouched and looked at the ground. "More than 2 horses came through here, and boots. At least 4 men." She looked at the tree line. Nothing moved. "They wanted you to know it was deliberate." "Yes." "Not yet ready to do something direct. This is a warning." "This time," Silas said. He stood up. His face in the dark was impossible to read, but his voice had gone flat in a way she'd learned meant he was controlling something. He wasn't frightened. She didn't think Silas Boone frightened easily. But he was angry, and the anger was the kind that made him careful rather than reckless, which she'd noticed about him and thought was both admirable and somewhat unnerving. "We need to move the documents," Elena said immediately. "Everything we have copies of the affidavits, the contracts, not all in one place." "Agreed." "Adelaide should have one set. Pruitt can hold another. We keep the originals but split them if anything happens." She was already moving toward the house. "And we need to accelerate the timeline. Harker knows what we're doing. The longer we take, the more time he has to pressure the people who signed." Inside, she went directly to her bag and checked the oilcloth packet. Intact. She began making copies by lamplight. She'd been doing this since Garnet Falls, building redundancy into every document, while Silas went back outside to check the barn and the house perimeter. When he came back in, he had a set expression and a smear of mud on his coat sleeve. "They were in the barn," he said. "Didn't take anything but the horses, which means the horses weren't the point." "The point was being here," Elena said, not looking up from the papers. "The point was knowing they could walk onto your land and do what they wanted." "Elena." His voice had a different quality to it. She looked up. "2 of the affidavits are gone from the barn copy I kept there, the ones from Birch and from the Reyes family." She went still. She and Silas looked at each other across the lamplight. "They're inside the operation," she said. "Someone in the settlements told Harker what we were collecting, which means at least one of the people we spoke to went back to him. Or was pressured. Or both." She set down her pen. "Which ones are most at risk now, Birch or Consolata?" "Birch has more to lose. His building, his business. Harker could threaten the existing lien on it." Silas sat down across from her. "Consolata's situation is different. She's got 3 boys and no husband. If Harker sends someone there, we go tomorrow," Elena said. "First thing. We warn them and we get replacement signatures if they'll still give them." She looked at the papers in front of her. "And we don't keep copies anywhere on this property anymore. Everything goes to Adelaide from here." She went back to writing and didn't stop until the lamp ran low on oil. It was Silas who spoke first into the tired silence that followed. He'd been sitting across from her, cleaning and reloading the pistol he'd had in his coat, and he set it on the table between them with a quiet, deliberate sound and said, "You should know something." She looked at him. "When Harker took Croft's land," he said, "I was the one who found the clause. Too late to help. Croft had already defaulted. But I found it, and I showed it to Croft and told him he should fight it. He said he didn't have the energy anymore. He said he was just going to go." He paused. "I let him go. I didn't push. I thought I'd done my part by showing him what was there." Elena waited. She could tell there was more. "If I'd pushed then," Silas said, "the way you're pushing now, found a lawyer, found the other contracts, built something, this might have been over 2 years ago, before Pruitt, before Mrs. Plum's husband died thinking it was his fault, before you." He said the last word differently from the others. Not quite the same weight, but he kept his voice even. "I had the information, and I didn't do enough with it." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know I understand what you're doing and why it matters." He met her eyes. and because I owe this more than just going along for the ride. She thought about that. She thought about what it cost a person to say something like that, to sit across from someone and name the thing they'd failed at, and make it plain without softening it. Most people couldn't do that. Most people built a story around their failures that absolved them, or they buried the failures so deep they stopped knowing they were there. "You're here now," she said finally. "I know, I just wanted—" "Silas!" She waited until he looked at her directly. "You're here now, that's what matters." She gathered the last of the papers. "Now help me figure out how we get to Consolata Reyes by morning." They reached Consolata's place at sunup and found her already awake, already watching the road from her front window. When she opened the door and saw Elena, her face was a mixture of fear and relief, so tangled Elena couldn't immediately separate them. "Someone came last night," Consolata said. She kept her voice low, though her boys were presumably still asleep. "A man. He said if I didn't take my name off the paper, there would be trouble for my oldest. He knew my oldest son's name." Her voice caught on the last word. He knew his name. Elena felt the fury move through her like a current, clean and cold and useful. She let it pass through, and then she set it aside in the place where she'd been storing it for weeks, the place where she kept everything that would make her reckless if she let it out too soon. "Is your signature still on the affidavit?" she asked. "Yes," Consolata said. "But—" "Keep it there," Elena said. "I know that's a hard thing to ask. I know what he threatened, and I know you have your sons to think about." She stepped closer and lowered her own voice. "But if you pull your name, he wins one person at a time. And this doesn't stop. He doesn't stop. He'll find another reason, another threat, and another one after that until there is nothing left to take." She held Consolata's gaze. "I have 22 other signatures. Each one of those people is in the same position you are right now. If we hold, all 23 of us, he cannot frighten us one by one because there are too many of us to threaten individually. But if we start losing names, we start losing people, and the ones left become easier targets." Consolata was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, from somewhere in the back of the house, a child's voice called out something sleepy and indistinct. "What happens to my boys if this goes wrong?" she asked. "I don't know," Elena said. Because she didn't. She wasn't going to pretend she did. "I can't promise you it goes right. I can promise you I won't stop and I won't let it go, and I will be standing in that courtroom regardless of what it costs me." She paused. "My daughter is 5 days north of here with people who bought her. I know what it is to have someone you love in that position and not know what's coming for them. I know it better than I know almost anything." Consolata looked at her for a long time. Then she exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry considerable weight with it. "I keep my name on the paper," she said. When they rode away from Consolata's place an hour later, Silas said, "We're running out of time before Harker does something worse than broken fences and stolen horses." "I know." "We have 23 signatures. Adelaide said 30. "I know that too." Elena was looking at the road ahead, at the sky above the tree line, which was pale and cold and suggested weather coming. But 23 is enough to file a preliminary injunction. It won't stop him entirely, but it will slow the intimidation. Once there's an active legal proceeding, he has to be more careful about direct threats. Will Adelaide agree to file with 23? "She'll have to," Elena said, "because tonight I'm going to write her a letter explaining that if we wait for 30, we may not have 23. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind coming down from the north and thought about Rose, as she did every day, every hour, in the background of every calculation she made. Rose, who was now close to a month old, and who Elena had held for 11 minutes, and who existed in her mother's mind as a specific weight and warmth and smell that Elena carried like something both unbearable and necessary. "I'm coming," she thought, not as a prayer, as a statement of fact. 4 days later, the injunction was filed in Millhaven. Adelaide had agreed, tersely, after reading Elena's letter twice, and had ridden to the secondary registry herself to ensure it was processed correctly, and that a copy went immediately by rider to the territorial court. Colton Drew in Garnet Falls would know about it within a week. By then, it would be too late to intercept. Elena was on the road back from Millhaven, riding beside Silas in the wagon with the sky going dark and cold ahead of them, when they came around a bend in the road and found three riders blocking it. The middle one was Doss. She recognized him before she recognized his face, recognized him by his size, by the way he sat on a horse like he was daring it to object. He had two men flanking him she didn't know, and all three of them were carrying rifles laid across their saddles in the particular way that meant they'd been arranged to be visible. Silas stopped the wagon. His hand moved toward the seatboard where the rifle was stored and then stopped moving, because Doss had already raised his own, not aimed yet, just raised. "Mr. Harker would like a word with Miss Cross," Doss said. His voice was flat and carrying and completely without inflection, like a man reading from something he'd memorized. Elena sat very still in the wagon seat. The wind was cold on her face. She could feel her heart beating in her ears. "Miss Cross isn't available," Silas said. His voice was calm in a way that she thought probably took considerable effort. Mr. Harker anticipated that response. Doss reached into his coat with his free hand and produced a folded paper. "He asked me to deliver this instead." One of the flanking riders walked his horse forward and held the paper out toward the wagon. Elena took it, unfolded it, read it. It was a legal notice signed by Orrin Fell and stamped with the seal of the Garnet Falls Land Registry. It cited Territorial Statute 47, the one Harker had discussed with Fell weeks ago, the material witness provision, and it stated that Elena Cross was required to appear before an emergency arbitration in Garnet Falls in 5 days' time to give testimony in a contract dispute involving the estate of one Clyde Harker versus various unnamed defendants. An arbitration that would be presided over by Colton Drew. She folded the paper back up with hands that were steady because she made them steady, and she looked at Doss and she said very clearly, "Tell Mr. Harker that we received his paper." Doss looked at her for a moment with those small, flat eyes. Then he turned his horse without another word, and the three riders moved off the road. Elena held the paper in her lap and stared at the road ahead. The sky was fully dark now. The wind cut through her coat like it had intentions. "He's trying to pull you into a proceeding he controls," Silas said quietly. Drew presiding, Fell presenting, on his timetable and his terms. "I know what he's doing," Elena said. "If you don't appear, he can file for contempt." "I know." She turned the paper over in her hands. "So we appear. We just don't appear the way he expects." She looked up at the dark sky, at the stars beginning to show through the cold, and something was settling in her the way a decision settles. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just quiet and complete. She had 23 signatures in Adelaide's office and an injunction filed in Millhaven and a man sitting next to her who had said, "I'm with you," and meant it. And she had been through enough in the last months to know the difference between a wall you couldn't get through and a wall that just looked that way until you found the door. Clyde Harker was good at building walls. She was getting better at finding doors. "We need to get to Adelaide tonight," she said. "And we need to send riders to every person who signed an affidavit and tell them what's happening. Because if Harker thinks he can pull me into an arbitration and undo everything we built, he's going to find out that what he's really done is give us a room and a date and a reason to show up together." Silas looked at her. The road ahead was dark and the wind was picking up, and there were 3 days before they needed to be in Garnet Falls. "Then let's ride," he said. They rode through the night to reach Adelaide's office, arriving when the town was still dark, and the only light was the one burning in the upstairs window that told Elena Adelaide was already awake, already working, because Adelaide Marsh was the kind of woman who seemed to exist in a permanent state of managed urgency. She read Harker's notice twice, standing, still in her coat from wherever she'd just come from. Then she set it on her desk and looked at Elena with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite satisfaction, but something complicated between the two. "Statute 47, she said. "He had this prepared. He didn't draft this after the injunction was filed. He had it ready, which means he anticipated the injunction." "He has someone watching," Elena said. "Someone in Dry Fork or the surrounding settlements who told him what we were collecting. Or someone in Millhaven." Adelaide set the paper down. "The registry clerk there. I don't know him well. I trusted the process, but I may have been wrong to trust it without verification. Does it matter now? Silas said from the doorway. He hadn't fully come into the room. He had a habit of staying near exits in unfamiliar places that Elena had noticed and thought probably had history behind it she didn't know. It matters for what we do next, Adelaide said. She moved to the map on her wall, still marked with 11 red dots, now with additional marks around them showing the locations of everyone who'd signed an affidavit. Parker's arbitration is in 5 days. In Garnet Falls, presided by Drew, who we believe is compromised. His goal is to pull Elena into a proceeding on his terms, establish a counter-narrative to our injunction, and generate a ruling that he can use to delay or block the territorial court from taking our case seriously. Can he do that? Elena asked. Legally. Statute 47 gives broad latitude for emergency arbitration in contract disputes. It was written for legitimate commercial situations, but it can be stretched. Adelaide's mouth tightened. Fell knows how to stretch things. That's established. Then we don't fight the arbitration. We use it, Elena said. Adelaide looked at her. He's given us a room, Elena said. She'd been thinking about this since the road, since Doss handed her that paper and rode away, and the shape of it had been getting clearer with every mile. A date, a location, and he expects us to show up scrambling to defend ourselves, or not show up at all and hand him the contempt charge. But what if we show up with everyone? Everyone, Adelaide repeated. Every person who signed. Every person who has a story about Clyde Harker. We walk into that arbitration not as a defendant responding to his complaint, but as 23 witnesses presenting evidence of a coordinated criminal operation. She looked at the map. His arbitration gives us a stage. We're going to use it. Adelaide was quiet for a long moment. She had a particular kind of silence when she was working through something legally. It had a quality of concentration to it, like water finding a level. There are procedural problems with that approach, she said finally. Drew will try to limit testimony. He'll try to restrict the scope to the specific contract in dispute. And you'll object at every limitation he tries to impose, Elena said, on the record, because the record is what we need. Every objection he makes, every time he tries to cut off testimony, it goes into the transcript, and that transcript goes to the territorial court. Adelaide looked at her for another long moment. You want to use the arbitration to build the transcript that discredits the arbitration. And Drew with it. Adelaide turned back to the map. She studied it with her hands behind her back and her glasses still on her forehead. Then she said, I need to send riders tonight. Every signatory needs to be in Garnet Falls in 4 days. That means some of them are riding 3 days straight. Tell them what's at stake, Elena said. They'll come. Some of them are frightened. I know. Elena thought of Consolata's face in the doorway at sunrise, the fear and the fury so tangled together. Tell them they're not coming alone. Tell them there will be 22 other people standing in the same room. That's different from standing alone. Adelaide nodded slowly. She picked up her pen. I also need to send something to Judge Wills before the arbitration happens. Not a formal filing, just a notification that an arbitration is occurring in his jurisdiction involving parties who have an active injunction in Millhaven. That way he's aware. That way, if Drew tries to use the arbitration ruling to block the Millhaven filing, Wills already knows the context. Can you reach Wills in time? If I send tonight, she was already writing. Boone, I need your horse to be faster than it looks. It's faster than it looks, Silas said. The next 4 days were the most concentrated work Elena had done in her life, which was saying something given the last 2 months. She and Silas split up. She rode to the closer signatories, he took the farther ones, and she covered ground she'd already covered once before, but this time with a different message. Not will you sign, but will you come? Will you stand in a room in Garnet Falls and say in front of a recorder, and a man who works for the person who wronged you exactly what was done and what was taken and what it cost? Most of them said yes. A few needed longer conversations. Birch, who ran the feed store in Grey Hat and who had refused to sign for 20 minutes before signing, opened his door and looked at Elena on his porch and said, He sent another man last week, said if I appeared anywhere in connection with this business, he'd call the lien on the building immediately. He can't call the lien while there's an active legal proceeding, Elena said. Adelaide confirmed that. The injunction in Millhaven creates a stay on all Harker's enforcement actions, pending the territorial court review. Birch squinted at her. You sure about that? Adelaide Marsh is sure about it. Do you know who she is? I know who she is. Then you know she doesn't say things she isn't sure of. Birch looked past her at the road, at the cold morning. He was a man who had built something and watched it threatened, and was now being asked to risk the threat becoming real in order to fight it. That was not an easy position. Elena understood it wasn't easy. She didn't pretend it was. My wife thinks I should come, he said after a moment. Your wife sounds like a sensible person. She'd agree with you on that. He was quiet again. Then, what time does it start? She had 21 confirmed by the time she and Silas met back at Adelaide's office on the evening of the third day. 2 hadn't been reachable. One family had apparently moved on in the past weeks. Another had a sick child and couldn't travel. 21 was not 23. But 21 people walking into Clyde Harker's arbitration was, Adelaide said with the specific satisfaction of a lawyer who had found the lever she needed more than sufficient. The night before the arbitration, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the room Adelaide had put her in above the office, and she stared at the ceiling and she thought about Rose, which she did every night but tonight with a particular sharpness, because tomorrow was the beginning of the end of this part of it, and what came after tomorrow was the road north, and what waited at the end of the road north was a settlement called Marin's Gulch, and a couple named Hadley, and a baby girl who was now roughly 6 weeks old and who Elena had held for 11 minutes. She wondered what Rose looked like now. Whether she'd grown, whether she cried at night, whether the woman who was feeding her and holding her and not knowing her real name was, Elena made herself think this clearly and honestly, whether that woman was kind to her. She hoped she was. She hated hoping it, because hoping it meant admitting that someone else was doing what she should be doing, but she hoped it anyway because Rose was more important than her own feelings about it. She sat up and put her feet on the floor and sat in the dark for a while. Then she got up and went downstairs where the lamp was still burning and Adelaide was still at her desk, and she sat across from her and said, "Tell me what tomorrow looks like. Walk me through it." Adelaide looked up. She didn't seem surprised to see Elena there. Drew opens the session as arbitrator. Fell presents Harker's complaint, which will be framed as a contract dispute involving your labor agreement. He'll argue the release Boone purchased was procedurally invalid, or that it doesn't fully extinguish the underlying debt. My first move is to challenge Drew's authority to preside on grounds of conflict of interest. I have documentation of his relationship with Harker through the Croftland transfer. He'll overrule me. And that goes in the transcript. Everything goes in the transcript. The recorder is neutral. I confirmed that separately. His name is Alcott. He's been doing this for 12 years, and he has a reputation for accuracy and no known relationship with Harker. Adelaide laced her fingers together. After Drew overrules my challenge, Fell will begin presenting. At some point, he'll try to restrict the scope of testimony to your specific contract. I'll object. Overruled. That goes in the transcript. And then our people start talking, one by one. I'll call them in an order that builds, starting with the most straightforward fraud evidence and moving toward the larger pattern. Each witness tells their story. Fell will object to the relevance of every single one, and Drew will sustain, and I will note my objection on the record every single time. Adelaide paused. At some point, Drew may try to end the session. When he does, I'll invoke the territorial statute that requires arbitration proceedings to continue until all presented witnesses have been heard. It's the same statute Harker used to compel your appearance. Fell will have read it, but he may have thought about it only in one direction. Elena almost smiled. You're using his own paper against him. I'm using the law the way it's supposed to work, Adelaide said it simply, without drama, which is the only reliable tool I have. Elena looked at the papers spread across the desk. Her affidavits, the contracts, Adelaide's legal notes in a handwriting that was cramped and fast and completely legible, the organized record of months of work. What about after? Elena said. Even if tomorrow goes perfectly, even if the transcript is everything we need, the territorial court session isn't for another 5 weeks. Harker has 5 weeks to... The transcript goes to Judge Wills the same day the session ends, Adelaide said. Alcott will give me a certified copy within 24 hours. I file it with a motion to expedite review based on ongoing harm to identified parties. She looked at Elena directly. It doesn't guarantee Will's moves faster, but it makes the argument for speed. And Drew? Drew's conflict of interest is documented in the transcript. The regional authority above the territory, which I have also now notified separately, can investigate him independently of the main case. Adelaide paused. He's not your primary concern tomorrow. He's a problem we're solving on the side. Elena nodded. She looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she said, when this is over, when the court rules, what does the ruling actually say? About me. About Rose. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. Careful. If the court invalidates the original contract on grounds of fraud, which I believe they will, given the evidence we have, then everything that flowed from that contract is also invalidated, including the sale of Rose. A fraudulent contract cannot generate legal commerce. She paused again. That doesn't automatically restore custody. It creates the legal ground on which you can pursue it. The Hadleys will have standing to contest, especially if they purchased in good faith without knowing the sale was fraudulent. Elena absorbed that. So there's another fight after this one. Probably, Adelaide said quietly. I won't lie to you about that. I know. Elena stood up. I wasn't expecting this to be simple. She picked up her coat from the chair. I just needed to know what I was walking into. She went back upstairs and lay down, and this time she slept, because she needed to and because she had trained herself over the past months to sleep when sleep was available. The way you learn to eat when food is available when you've gone long enough without. The arbitration room in Garnet Falls was a converted meeting hall on the ground floor of a building 2 streets from the courthouse. It had 12 chairs arranged in rows, a table at the front for the arbitrator, and a small desk to one side where Alcott the recorder sat with his equipment and his 12 years of neutral professionalism. Elena arrived with Adelaide and Silas to find 7 of their witnesses already there, more coming through the door in 1s and 2s over the next 20 minutes. Consolata Reyes came in with her oldest boy, 15, serious-faced, who stood against the wall with his arms crossed and watched everyone in the room with protective attention. Elbert Pruitt came in with his hat in his hands as always. Mrs. Plum came in with a neighbor woman who was apparently not a signatory but had come to sit with her, and nobody stopped them. By the time Clyde Harker entered the room with Orrin Fell at his side and Doss positioned near the back door, there were 19 people in the chairs and 2 more standing along the wall. Harker looked at the room and something crossed his face, very briefly, there and gone, that Elena had never seen there before. Not quite alarm. Something closer to recalculation. She watched him do it. She watched him look at the room and adjust his expectations in real time. And she thought, good. Let him adjust. Bell leaned close to Harker and said something in a low voice. Harker said something back. Then they went to the table and sat down. And a moment later, Colton Drew came in from the side door and took the arbitrator's chair. Drew was a small man with a neat beard and the careful grooming of someone who wanted to be taken seriously. He had the court seal on the table in front of him and a copy of the statute and a set of papers Elena assumed were Fell's complaint documents. He looked at the room with visible discomfort. He had expected, Elena guessed, something manageable, something small. This was not small. This session is called to order, Drew said. His voice was trying to be authoritative and was almost succeeding. The matter before this arbitration is the contract dispute of Harker versus the estate, pursuant to Territorial Statute 47, with Elena Cross as a compelled material witness. All testimony will be recorded by Mr. Alcott. He looked at Adelaide. Counsel for the witness may be present, but is not a party to these proceedings. Adelaide stood up. In that case, I'd like to raise a preliminary matter before proceedings begin. Drew looked pained. This is not a court of, I'm aware of that. The preliminary matter is a formal objection to your authority to preside on grounds of documented conflict of interest. She placed a paper on the recorder's desk. I'm entering into the record the details of Mr. Drew's involvement in the transfer of the Croft property title in the previous year, processed through this registry in a transaction connected to the respondent in these proceedings. For the record. Drew's face went through several things rapidly. I'm overruling that objection. Noted, Adelaide said, and sat down. Alcott's pen moved. Fell began his presentation of Harker's complaint with professional smoothness. He was good at this. Elena had to acknowledge that. He had a way of making the fraudulent sound bureaucratic and the bureaucratic sound legitimate. But Adelaide objected to the foundation of nearly every evidentiary point he raised, and each objection was recorded. And by the time Fell finished his opening, the transcript already contained a detailed map of every procedural irregularity in the proceeding. Then Adelaide said, I'd like to call the first witness. Fell started to object. Drew started to limit scope. Adelaide invoked the statute, the same one, word for word, that had compelled Elena's presence, and cited the provision requiring all presented witnesses to be heard, and Drew stared at the paper she placed in front of him with an expression of a man who has just realized the room he's locked someone into has a second door. Elbert Pruitt was the first witness. He sat in the chair at the front of the room with his hat on his knee, and he told his story plainly, without embellishment, in the flat, honest voice of a man who had been carrying the truth for too long and was relieved to finally put it down somewhere. He described the contract, the clause, the debt that grew without explanation, the land he'd lost. He named dates and figures from memory because he had gone over them so many times. They were as familiar as his own name. Fell objected 5 times during Pruitt's testimony. Drew sustained every one. Adelaide noted every objection on the record. Alcott wrote everything down. Then came the next witness and the next. Each one a different story with the same shape, a contract that seemed straightforward, a clause buried in language that could be misread, a debt that grew, something lost, a farm, a building, a piece of land that had been a family's whole future. Mrs. Plum spoke last among the group, and she spoke with the particular precision of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say and was not going to be stopped before she said it. And when she described her husband dying in the belief that he had failed his family, there was not a sound in the room except Alcott's pen. Harker's face throughout was controlled. He had a remarkable capacity for presenting calm. But Elena, who was watching him the way she had watched him for months, with the specific attention of someone cataloging a threat, saw his hand on the table move twice. Small movements, adjustments. The gold watch chain was still. When Adelaide finished presenting witnesses, Fell attempted to rebut with a procedural motion to strike all testimony as outside the scope of the proceeding. Drew began to rule in his favor. Adelaide placed another document on the recorder's desk. This is a certified copy of the injunction filed in Mill Haven, registering an active legal proceeding in these matters before the territorial court. Any ruling made in this arbitration that directly contradicts an active territorial court proceeding is appealable to the regional authority as an act of judicial interference. She said it quietly, without heat. I'm entering that into the record for Mr. Alcott. Drew looked at the document. He looked at Fell. Fell looked at Harker. Harker looked at Elena, for the first time since the session began. She looked back. She kept her face exactly still. Drew did not rule to strike the testimony. What he did was declare the session concluded, which was the most he had the power to do at this point, and gather his papers with movements that were very slightly too quick to look composed. Alcott had the certified transcript ready the following morning. Adelaide had a writer to Judge Wills before noon. The territorial court session opened 22 days later, not 6 weeks, 22 days, which Adelaide said was the fastest Wills had ever moved on a case in her experience, and which she attributed to the transcript arriving at a moment when the regional authority had also opened an inquiry into Colton Drew based on the conflict of interest documentation from the arbitration. The courtroom in Garnet Falls' pale brick courthouse had real benches and a real judge's bench, and the particular atmosphere of a place where the law was being practiced with the intention it was meant to have. Wills was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a face that suggested he had heard every variety of human behavior and had made a conscious decision not to be surprised by any of it. He had read the transcript. Elena could see it in how he looked at things. The specific look of someone who has already done considerable thinking and is now watching to see if the reality matches the picture. Fell presented Harker's position competently, but the foundation it rested on was different now than it had been in the arbitration room. There, he'd had Drew's compliance as a buffer. Here, every claim he made was met by Adelaide's counter-documentation, and Adelaide had had 22 days to prepare additional evidence, including, critically, a letter from a surveyor who had worked for Harker 3 years prior, and who had written, without being asked, after hearing from Pruitt that someone was finally building a case, to describe how he'd been instructed to remark property lines on 3 separate occasions in ways that encroached on neighboring land. The surveyor's letter was not expected. Elena could see that in Fell's posture when Adelaide entered it into evidence. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovering. But for a moment, the smooth surface of his presentation showed the grain beneath it. Elena testified for 4 hours over 2 days. She told the complete story without shortening it. The contract, the switched pages, the pregnancy, the birth during the storm, Rose being taken, the auction, Silas's intervention, every detail of every month since then. She told it as plainly and precisely as she had read Pruitt's contracts, as precisely as she had taken Consolata's door at sunrise, as precisely as she had sat across from Mrs. Plum and promised to stand in this exact room regardless of what it cost. Fell cross-examined her for another 2 hours. He was skilled at cross-examination. He had a technique of returning to the same points from slightly different angles, trying to find inconsistencies, trying to make confidence look like performance. Elena was not inconsistent. She had lived every word of what she'd said. You cannot find inconsistencies in a story someone lived. When she stepped down from the witness chair, she sat next to Silas on the bench and he said nothing, which was the right thing. He put his hand briefly on the back of hers on the bench between them, just for a moment, barely a gesture. And then he took it back. She kept her eyes on the front of the courtroom. On the 4th day, Judge Wills delivered his ruling. He spoke for a long time before he reached the conclusion, which was the legal custom, but which made the room very tense and very still. He covered the contract law, the evidence of fraudulent modification, the pattern across multiple transactions, the surveyor's letter, Drew's conflict of interest, the conduct of the arbitration proceeding. His voice was even throughout, measured, the voice of a man who had decided what was right and was stating it fully and without hurry. And then he said, "It is the finding of this court that the contract binding Elena Cross to the respondent was fraudulent from its inception and is therefore null and void in its entirety. Furthermore, any and all transactions that originated from or were enabled by said contract are likewise without legal foundation. The court finds that a pattern of deliberate fraud conducted through the systematic falsification of contract documents has been established against the respondent and refers this matter to the Regional Authority for Criminal Investigation." Elena heard it. She heard every word. She had prepared for this. She had built toward this, and still the words hit her in the chest in a way she hadn't quite expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something more complicated and more physical than either of those things. She pressed her hand flat on the bench between herself and Silas and breathed. Wills continued. "The court further finds that the sale of the infant designated in evidence as Rose Cross, conducted as a direct consequence of the fraudulent contract, has no legal standing. This court issues an order vacating the sale transaction and establishing Elena Cross as the child's legal parent with full custody rights, effective immediately." The room was not silent. People had been listening. Someone, she thought it was Mrs. Plum, made a sound that was not quite a word. Pruitt said something under his breath. Consolata, 3 benches back, had her arm around her oldest boy's shoulders. Elena sat very still. She was aware of Silas next to her, of Adelaide at the table in front, of the afternoon light coming through the courthouse windows. She was aware of all of it, and it all felt very far away and also very close, the way things feel when something is broken open inside you that you'd been keeping closed for a long time. She thought, Marin's Gulch, River Road, 5 days north. She thought, Hadley. She thought, Rose. The ruling didn't make it simple. Adelaide had told her that, and she'd known it before Adelaide told her. The Hadleys had received their copy of the court order by Ryder, which meant they had known what was coming for 3 days before Elena arrived. And 3 days is a long time when someone is preparing themselves to lose something they've been caring for since before they knew it could be taken. She and Silas left for Marin's Gulch the morning after the ruling. They didn't have a celebration, didn't have a formal moment of acknowledgement. There wasn't time, and also Elena didn't want one. What she wanted was to be on the road. What she wanted was north. They rode 4 days and part of a fifth, stopping only as long as the horses needed. The weather held, which felt unearned, but she took it. Silas drove, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and the not talking was fine. It had always been fine between them, in a way she'd stopped questioning and started trusting somewhere in the past 2 months without being able to name exactly when. On the afternoon of the 4th day, he said, "How are you doing?" She considered the question honestly. "Scared," she said. "Which is strange because I've been fighting for this for 2 months, and now that I'm close, I'm more frightened than I was when I was fighting." "What are you scared of?" She watched the road for a moment. "That she won't know me. That she'll look at me and I'll be a stranger to her." She paused. "She's 6 weeks old. She doesn't know anything yet. That's not rational, I know that, but..." "It's not about rational," Silas said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He was quiet. Then, "She'll know you. Maybe not today. Maybe it takes time. But she'll know you." Elena looked at him. He was watching the road, his face in profile, jaw set the way it got when he'd said something he meant and wasn't going to elaborate on. She turned back to the road. The cottonwoods along the creek ahead were turning, the first color of autumn coming into the leaves. The sky was the particular blue that only happens in the cold months, deep and cloudless, and impossibly wide. Marin's Gulch was a small settlement, smaller than Coldwater Crossing, quieter. The Hadley house was on the north edge of it, a frame house with a neat yard and a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for the season. There was smoke from the chimney. There was a dog on the porch that raised its head when the wagon pulled up. A woman came to the door before they reached it. She was maybe 40, with a plain face and dark circles under her eyes, and a baby held against her shoulder in the instinctive grip of someone who has been carrying an infant for weeks and has forgotten doing it consciously. She stood in the doorway and looked at Elena, and she didn't say anything. Her face was doing many things at once, none of them easy. Elena got down from the wagon. She stood in the yard and looked at the woman and at the bundle against her shoulder, and from 7 feet away she could see the back of a small, dark-haired head and a tiny fist curled against the woman's collar. Her throat closed completely. The woman on the porch said, in a voice that was trying very hard to hold steady, "She's a good baby. She sleeps well. We named her..." She stopped, swallowed. "We called her Clara. We didn't know her name." "Rose," Elena said. The word came out rough and quiet. "Her name is Rose." The woman, Mrs. Hadley, closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet and her jaw was tight, and she looked like someone holding a wall up through sheer effort of will. "My husband is inside," she said. "He'd like to say something if that's all right." "It's all right," Elena said. She walked up the porch steps. Mrs. Hadley turned slightly, and Elena saw Rose's face for the first time since Coldwater Crossing, since 11 minutes in a storage shed during a storm, and everything she had been holding carefully and at a distance for 2 months came loose at once. Rose was asleep. Her face was round and flushed from warmth, and she had her grandmother's nose, which Elena hadn't noticed in 11 minutes but could see clearly now. And her small hands were curled, and she was entirely, completely present in the world in a way that made Elena feel like the ground had shifted under her feet. She put her hand very gently on Rose's back, just her palm, just feeling her breathe. Mrs. Hadley was crying without sound, tears running down her face, making no attempt to stop them. She didn't look away from Elena. She didn't try to turn. She stood and let Elena touch her daughter's back and cried. And it was one of the bravest things Elena had ever seen a person do. "She likes to be sung to," Mrs. Hadley said. Her voice was very small. "In the evenings. It's the only thing that settles her when she's fussy." Elena looked at her. "Thank you for telling me that." "She doesn't like cold hands either. Mrs. Hadley stopped. She pressed her lips together hard. "She's a good baby," she said again, like she needed to say it one more time, like it was the only thing she was sure of right now. "I know," Elena said. "I know she is." She took Rose from Mrs. Hadley's arms. Rose stirred at the transfer, made a small protesting sound, and then settled against Elena's shoulder with the uncomplicated trust of an infant who doesn't yet know enough to be afraid of anything. Elena pressed her face against the small, dark-haired head and stood on the porch in the autumn afternoon and held her daughter for the second time, and the grief and the relief and the anger and the love and the sheer exhausting length of everything it had taken to get here all crashed together in her chest, and she let them. Behind her on the road, Silas had stayed in the wagon. He was looking at the cottonwoods along the fence line, giving her the space she needed, understanding without being told that some moments are not for witnesses. Inside the house, through the open door, Elena could hear Mr. Hadley moving, the sound of a chair, of someone sitting down heavily. A man who had also lost something today, who was also trying to find where he was in this new arrangement of the world. She would go inside and meet him. She would be decent about it because that was what the situation called for, and because Mrs. Hadley had sung to her daughter in the evenings and kept her warm, and that deserved decency in return, even through everything. But not yet. For one more minute, she stood on the porch with Rose against her shoulder and her eyes closed and the cold autumn air on her face and the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves around her, and she let herself be exactly where she was. Mr. Hadley came to the door eventually. He was a quiet man, taller than his wife, with the worn hands of someone who worked land for a living and the particular expression of a person who has spent several days preparing himself for something painful and has arrived at a kind of exhausted acceptance on the other side of that preparation. He looked at Elena holding Rose on his porch, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We didn't know. I want you to understand that. We didn't know what we were buying into." Elena looked at him. She believed him. That was the complicated thing about the Hadleys. They were not villains in this story. They were people who had wanted a child and had been handed an opportunity by a man who specialized in turning other people's desperation into his own profit. And they had taken it without asking enough questions, which was a human failure rather than a monstrous one. And Elena was tired enough and clear-eyed enough to know the difference. "I understand that," she said. He nodded. His jaw worked for a moment. "We tried for a long time to have children of our own. 8 years. Clara. Rose." He stopped, corrected himself with visible effort. Rose was the first time it felt like maybe the world was going to give us something instead of take it. He looked at his wife, who had moved to stand beside him, and something passed between them that was private and long and not for Elena to read. "We were wrong about where she came from. We were wrong to not ask more questions. That's on us." "Yes," Elena said, "because it was. Because being decent about something didn't mean pretending it wasn't true. Is there anything—" He stopped again, started over. "She likes to sleep on her left side. She can't tolerate cold milk. She has a little mark, a birthmark, just below her right ear. We used to say it looked like—" His voice broke on the last word. He pressed his mouth closed and looked at the yard, at nothing. Mrs. Hadley put her hand on her husband's arm. She had stopped crying, but her face still carried it, the way a field carries the evidence of rain long after the rain has stopped. Elena stood with Rose against her shoulder and looked at these two people who had fed her daughter and sung to her in the evenings, and kept her warm, and named her Clara. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness exactly, because that wasn't quite the right word for something that hadn't been a crime so much as a failure of asking, but something adjacent to it, something that had space in it. "The birthmark," she said. "I know about it. I saw it in 11 minutes, but I saw it." Mrs. Hadley made a sound that was very small and pressed her hand harder against her husband's arm. Elena shifted Rose to her other shoulder and said, "She's going to know your names. I'll make sure of that. When she's old enough to understand where she came from, all of it, she'll know that you were kind to her." She paused. "That's not nothing. It's actually a great deal." She didn't wait for a response. She walked down the porch steps to where Silas was waiting by the wagon, and she got up onto the seat with Rose still held against her, and Silas took the reins without a word, and they drove out of Marin's Gulch as the afternoon light went low and amber over the settlement's rooftops. They were 2 miles down the river road when Elena realized she was shaking, not from cold, just shaking, her whole body, the way structures shake after the pressure that's been holding them rigid finally releases. She pressed Rose closer and breathed and let it move through her and pass. Silas said nothing. He drove. After a while, Rose made a small sound, not quite a cry, just a sound, the sound of a person asserting their presence. And Elena looked down at her and Rose looked up, not focusing yet the way infants don't focus, but looking in the general direction of Elena's face with a kind of earnest, unfocused attention that was so completely itself that Elena laughed. It came out cracked and wet, but it was real. It was the realest thing she'd felt in months, and Silas heard it and the corner of his mouth moved. "She's looking at me," Elena said, which was obvious and didn't need saying. "Yes," Silas said. "She has no idea who I am." "No," he agreed, "but she will." Elena said it quietly, not to him, mostly to herself or to Rose or to the river road and the amber light and the whole long complicated world. She will. They camped that night on the road because it was too far to push through to anything with a roof, and Silas built a fire, and Elena sat with Rose and figured out, through the trial and error of someone learning something entirely new, what Rose needed and when and how. It was not smooth. Rose cried for 40 minutes at one point for reasons Elena couldn't immediately identify, and Elena tried everything she could think of, and eventually Silas, who had been sitting quietly on his side of the fire, said, "Try walking, just walking." Elena looked at him. "You know about babies?" "My sister had 4, he said. "I was around for the first 2. She hadn't known he had a sister. There was still so much she didn't know about him. She stood up and walked, back and forth along the edge of the firelight, steady rhythmic steps. And Rose stopped crying within a few minutes. Not gradually, but almost suddenly, like a switch, and then was asleep. Elena sat back down across the fire from Silas with the careful deliberateness of someone carrying something irreplaceable. "Thank you," she said. "It was a guess," he said. "Could have been wrong." But it wasn't. He looked at the fire. "No." She looked at him across the flames. This man she'd known for 2 months, who had paid an unreasonable price to free a stranger and then asked nothing in return and meant it, who had said, "I'm with you on a porch," while his fence was being torn apart and ridden through nights and sat through legal proceedings and driven a wagon 200 miles, and who was now sitting across from her on the ground next to a fire on the river road north, while she held her daughter for the second time in her life. She had been so careful not to think about what she felt about him. There had been too much else to think about, too many fires, too much urgent present tense. But sitting here now, with Rose asleep and the night quiet and the immediate emergency resolved into something more like the long, slow work of building a life, she found she couldn't be careful about it anymore. "What do you want?" she asked him. "Not from me. I know you don't want anything from me. I mean, in general. What does Silas Boone actually want?" He looked at her across the fire with those dark brown eyes. He seemed to think about the question like he thought about most questions. Carefully, not performing the thought but actually doing it. "What I've got," he said finally. "The ranch. Work that means something. People around who aren't—" He paused. "People who aren't Harker." He almost smiled. "That last part has been easier to find lately." "That's all?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Yeah, but the rest of it isn't something I have a clean way to say." She held his gaze. She had gotten very good at reading him over the past months, at understanding what the pauses meant, what the controlled flatness in his voice meant, what it meant when he looked at the tree line instead of at her. And she understood what this pause meant. She just wasn't sure yet what to do with that understanding, because she was 6 weeks out from the worst thing that had happened to her, and she had a sleeping infant in her arms, and the last time she had trusted a situation, it had unraveled into something she wouldn't have imagined in a nightmare. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was the most honest thing she could offer right now. "I need you to know that. I'm not going to take Rose and disappear and leave you with a cleaned-out barn and an outstanding balance." She looked at the fire. "Whatever this is, whatever we figure out it is, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know that." "How?" "Because I've watched you for 2 months," he said simply. "People who are going to leave have a particular way of being in a place. You don't have that." She thought about her grandmother, who had said something similar once about her garden, about how you can tell the plants that are going to come back from the ones that won't by something in how they stand in winter. She hadn't understood it then. She thought she understood it now. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They didn't say anything else that night, but something had been said that needed saying, and the fire burned down in its own time, and Rose slept, and the stars over the river road were very clear and very cold and very numerous. They arrived back at Garnet Falls 3 days later to news that had traveled faster than they had. Adelaide met them on the street outside her office with a letter in her hand and an expression Elena had not seen on her face before, something closer to open relief than Adelaide typically permitted herself. "The regional authority has opened a formal investigation into Harker's operations," she said, before Elena had fully gotten down from the wagon. "Drew has been suspended from the registry pending review. And," she held up the letter, "Orenfell has engaged a different lawyer and submitted a statement of cooperation to the regional investigators." Elena stood in the street with Rose in her arms. "Fell is cooperating. Apparently he decided that Harker's ship had taken on too much water, and he'd rather be on the shore than go down with it." Adelaide said it without particular warmth. She had a specific kind of contempt for lawyers who were careful about which side of the law they stood on depending on which side looked more profitable at the moment. "His cooperation means the investigators will have documentation of every transaction Harker ran through Fell's office for the past 6 years. Every contract, every modification, every title transfer." "How many total?" Silas said. Adelaide looked at the letter. "Fell's preliminary statement references 41 separate transactions." 41. Elena absorbed that. 41 families, 41 pieces of land, 41 sets of buried clauses and compounding debts and things lost. The number sat heavy and large. The 11 red marks on Adelaide's map had always been known to be the beginning of the count, but hearing the full number said out loud in the morning street of Garnet Falls with her daughter in her arms made it very real and very large. "What happens to the land?" Elena asked. "The properties he seized? Can people get them back?" "Some of them," Adelaide said carefully. "Where title can be clearly re-established and the property hasn't been sold on to a third party. It's going to be a long process. Some of these will take a year or more to resolve. The regional court will appoint a receiver to manage Harker's assets during the investigation." She paused. "Croft's land is one of the cleaner cases. The title went directly from Croft to Harker and hasn't moved since. Silas, if you have contact with Croft—" "I'll find him," Silas said. Adelaide nodded. She looked at Elena. At Elena's face, at Rose, at the whole picture of the two of them standing in the street, and for a moment her expression softened in a way that she clearly didn't entirely intend but didn't try to conceal. "You should know," she said, "that Judge Wills has written a formal letter to the territorial court recommending that the statute permitting the kind of emergency arbitration Drew presided over be reviewed for amendment. He cited the proceedings here as evidence that the statute has structural vulnerabilities." She paused. "He cited your case by name." Elena looked at her. "My name? Elena Cross versus the fraudulent application of Territorial Statute 47. Adelaide folded the letter. "You're going to be cited in territorial legal history." Elena didn't know what to do with that exactly. She looked down at Rose, who was awake now and doing the unfocused, earnest-looking things she did, and thought about the woman who had signed a 6-page contract in desperation and found out too late that 3 pages had been switched, and thought about the version of that woman who had nothing and was for sale on a wooden crate outside a trading post in the rain, and thought about the distance between that version and this one. It was not a comfortable or triumphant thought. It was more complicated than that, more tired, more grateful, in a way that didn't feel like gratitude so much as a kind of stunned accounting of everything it had taken and everything it had cost. "Come inside," Adelaide said. "There's more to go over and the baby looks cold." Rose was not cold. She was wrapped in more layers than was probably necessary. But Elena went inside anyway. What came after the ruling and the investigation and Fell's cooperation was not a clean resolution. Elena had known it wouldn't be. 41 cases meant 41 different sets of circumstances, 41 different chains of title, 41 different conversations about what could be reclaimed and what couldn't. Adelaide took on 7 of the clearest cases directly and helped identify other lawyers for the remaining ones. Pruitt got his land back within 4 months, one of the faster resolutions, because his case was clean and his documentation was complete, and Harker had not sold the title on. Mrs. Plum's situation was more complicated because her husband's death had created additional legal layers, but Adelaide worked it through over the course of 6 months, and Mrs. Plum ended the process owning her home outright for the first time in 4 years. Birch never lost his building. The injunction had stayed Harker's enforcement, and then the investigation made enforcement permanently moot. He came to Garnet Falls in the spring to tell Adelaide, and ended up, somewhat to everyone's surprise, including his own, shaking Elena's hand with considerable feeling and saying, "You were right about anger being more durable than fear. I'm going to remember that." "So am I," Elena said. Consolata Reyes got a letter from the regional authority in March, confirming that her family's property had been fully restored and that the lien Harker had held against it was invalidated. She wrote Elena a letter in return. Elena kept it. It was not eloquent. Consolata was not a woman who wrote letters in her first language, let alone her second. But it was real, and it said the thing it needed to say, which was, "We made it. Thank you for making us stand together. My boys are fine." Harker himself was arrested 6 weeks after Fell's cooperation statement in a settlement 2 territories west where he had apparently been making preliminary inquiries about land transactions. The regional investigators found him without drama. He did not run. Elena thought about that later, says, the fact that he hadn't run, and decided it told her something about the particular type of person he was. He had operated for so long in a world where power was a matter of paperwork and confidence, and the careful management of who knew what, that he had perhaps not fully internalized that a world existed in which those tools stopped working. He hadn't run because he hadn't genuinely believed, until the moment the investigators appeared, that this was something he couldn't manage his way out of. Elena heard about the arrest from Adelaide and felt nothing dramatic, not satisfaction, something quieter than that, something more like the particular stillness that follows a long, loud noise. She had thought about Harker every day for months, had run his face and his methods and his pale eyes and his gold watch chain through her mind so many times that he had taken up a disproportionate residence in her mental space, and now she found that she wanted him to take up less, that she was ready to stop giving him the room. She didn't fully succeed at that immediately. These things don't happen immediately. But she started. The ranch in the weeks after their return was different from the ranch she had arrived at 2 months earlier. Partly it was Rose, who changed the texture of every room simply by being in it, who had opinions about things now, at 2 months old, loud and specific opinions expressed with her whole body, opinions about whether she was hungry and whether she was warm enough, and whether she was being held the way she wanted to be held. Partly it was Elena herself, who had stopped being a visitor somewhere around the time she started rebuilding the kitchen shelving that had been poorly installed by whoever had built them originally, using tools she found in the barn and her own assessment of what level actually meant. Silas had come home to find the shelving project in progress and had looked at it for a moment and then said, "The left side is still 2 degrees off." "I know," Elena said. "I'm getting there." He picked up another tool and helped her finish it without being asked, and they ate dinner with the new shelves slightly crooked on the left side and Rose asleep in the wooden cradle Silas had built, not elegantly, not with any particular woodworking skill, but solidly, with the specific determination of a man who had decided something needed to exist and had made it exist through effort rather than talent. Elena had cried when she saw the cradle, not in front of him. In the barn briefly, with Pot sitting next to her giving her the focused, companionable attention that dogs offer in these moments, without any understanding of the cause and without needing to. The months that followed were the ordinary kind of hard, not the catastrophic kind, not the kind that involved men on horses and legal proceedings and stolen babies, just the daily hard of building a life that was real rather than provisional. Rose had a period of 3 weeks in November where she didn't sleep properly, and therefore no one slept properly. And Elena walked the length of the porch every night until her feet ached, and Silas took the second half of the night without being asked, and they were both, by the end of those 3 weeks, running on the frayed edge of their patience in ways that occasionally showed. One night Elena said something short and unkind about the fact that the wood stove needed a piece of metalwork done that Silas had said he was going to do and hadn't yet done. And it wasn't really about the wood stove. It was about being exhausted and frightened because Rose had a slight fever that was probably nothing, and she had no way to be sure it was nothing. And Silas knew that and didn't rise to the wood stove comment, but also didn't placate her about it. Just said, "I'll do it tomorrow," in a flat, even voice. And she said, "You said that last week." And he said, "I know I did." And they were both quiet for a moment, and then Elena said, "I'm scared about the fever." And he said, "I know. Me too." And that was the end of the argument about the wood stove. He did the metalwork the next day. The fever broke the same afternoon. Marta Dean came out in December to check on Rose, had been coming monthly, which was more than strictly necessary, but which Elena suspected was as much about Marta wanting to see the baby as about medical necessity, because Marta, for all her brisk practicality, had a specific quality of expression when she held Rose that suggested she was not as immune to infants as her professional manner implied. She pronounced Rose healthy and growing correctly, and on her way out said to Elena, with the particular directness of a woman who has decided something needs to be said, "You know the reason that baby is healthy is because you are. I want you to remember that. Taking care of yourself is taking care of her." "I know," Elena said. "You know it in theory," Marta said. "That's different from acting on it." She was not entirely wrong. Elena had a habit of measuring her own needs against Rose's and finding her own consistently less urgent, which was understandable, but which, as Marta pointed out with clinical precision, was not actually sustainable. Elena was working on it. It was slow work. Some things are. Elbert Pruitt came to the ranch in February, not with contracts this time, but with two people Elena hadn't met. A man named Vargas and his wife, who had a property dispute case that was moving through the regional court, and who had heard about Elena from Pruitt and from Adelaide and had come, Pruitt explained with some embarrassment, because they wanted to ask if Elena would be willing to give a statement in support of their case. Elena looked at Vargas and his wife, who were sitting at her kitchen table with the specific posture of people who have come to ask for something they're not sure they have any right to ask for. She looked at Pruitt, who was turning his hat in his hands again, which she had come to understand was just what his hands did when he was in a room with other people. She thought about Adelaide, who was still working 7 of the 41 cases. She thought about the letter from Consolata. She thought about Mrs. Plum signing the affidavit with a shaking hand that didn't stop. "Tell me what you need," she said to Vargas. She gave the statement. It wasn't the last one she gave. Over the following months, she became something she hadn't set out to become and hadn't exactly planned for. A person other people came to when they had a Harker-shaped problem. Not always Harker specifically, but the type of thing Harker represented. The buried clause and the fraudulent modification and the debt that grew in the dark without your knowledge until it had consumed everything you'd built. She wasn't a lawyer. She was careful about that distinction, careful not to pretend she had expertise she didn't have. But she had read 41 contracts now, and she knew what they looked like from the inside, and that particular knowledge was worth something to people who needed it. Adelaide called it, once, with characteristic dryness, the most effective unpaid paralegal practice in the territory. Elena said, "I'm not a paralegal." "No," Adelaide agreed. "You're something the territory doesn't have a word for yet." The question of what Elena and Silas were to each other resolved itself the way most real things resolve. Gradually, without a specific moment you could point to, through the accumulation of days and meals and arguments and the specific intimacy of people who have been through something real together and have chosen to stay. There was an evening in March when Rose was asleep, and they were sitting on the porch in the cold that was starting to have the edge of spring in it, and Silas said, without particular preamble, "I'd like you to stay." Elena looked at him. "I am staying." "I mean," he stopped. She had never seen him struggle with words before. It was the kind of thing that could have been endearing and was, and she was not going to make it easier for him because she thought he should have to say it. "Permanently," he said finally. "I'd like you to stay permanently, both of you." She looked at the cottonwoods along the creek. The last of the winter was still in them, but not much. "Are you asking me something specific?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Then ask it specifically." He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and helpless, which she had also never seen on his face before, and which she found she was going to remember for a long time. Then he said, "Will you marry me?" in the direct, unperformed way that he said most things, without decoration, just the plain words in their plain meaning. She had known it was coming. She had known it for weeks, the way you know things that are moving slowly toward you but haven't arrived yet. She had thought about what she would say and had arrived, finally, at the understanding that there was only one honest answer and that she'd been ready to give it for longer than she'd admitted to herself. "Yes," she said, "but I need you to know something first." "What?" "I'm not going to be easy to be married to. I have a baby who doesn't sleep through the night. I've been talking to strangers about their legal problems twice a week for 3 months. I rebuilt your shelves without asking, and they're still not perfectly level, and I have opinions about things that I'm going to keep having regardless of what you think about them." He looked at her for a moment. "I know all of that," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it out loud, so it's said." Then it's said. He held her gaze. "My answer is still yes." She nodded once, the same way she had nodded when he first paid her debt, and offered her a choice. A single, deliberate nod that meant, understood, agreed. We proceed. They were married in April, in Adelaide's office, because Adelaide was the only person in the territory with the standing to officiate, and also because Adelaide, when asked, had said yes with such immediate and uncharacteristic warmth that Elena suspected she had been waiting to be asked. Pruitt was there, and Marta Dean and Consolata had ridden 2 days with her oldest boy, who stood against the wall with his arms crossed in exactly the same way he had stood in the arbitration room, watchful and protective, though the thing he was protecting was now something entirely different. Rose slept through the ceremony in Consolata's arms, which was both inconvenient and completely in character. The summer was hot and full of work, the kind of work that builds things, rather than the kind that defends them, and Elena found she was not entirely sure how to be a person who was building something rather than fighting for it, which was an adjustment she hadn't anticipated needing to make. She had been so long in the mode of urgency, of the next step and the next threat and the next document, that the ordinary pace of a life well underway felt unfamiliar in ways she had to consciously adjust to. She talked to Silas about this one evening, which was still something that required a small internal decision on her part, the part of her that had learned to keep her processing internal, to show only what was necessary. She was working on that part. Silas listened and then said, "You built for a long time. You're allowed to live in it now." "It doesn't feel natural yet," she said. "It will," he said. Then after a pause, "It takes longer than you expect." She looked at him. "Speaking from experience." "Speaking from experience," he said. She thought about the 4 chairs at his table when she'd first walked into this house. 4 chairs in a house where one man lived, waiting for people who hadn't arrived yet. She thought about how long he had been building and waiting, quietly, without expecting anything to come. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For the 4 chairs," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he understood what she meant, and he looked at her with an expression she could read now. Fully, completely, the way you read something in a language you've learned thoroughly enough to stop translating. Rose, at 8 months old, was a person with specific and strongly held views about the world. She had views about breakfast and about Pot the dog, who she had discovered she could grab by the ear and who bore this with a dignity that suggested he had decided this was his purpose. She had views about being set down when she wanted to be held and about being held when she wanted to be set down. She had a laugh that arrived without warning and was completely out of proportion with her size. A real laugh, full-bodied, the kind that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. She had her grandmother's nose, which Elena saw more clearly every day. She was learning the world with the total, fearless commitment of someone who has not yet been given any reason to be afraid of it. She didn't know about Coldwater Crossing. She didn't know about the storm, or the 11 minutes, or the long months that had passed between then and now. She knew Silas's face and Elena's voice and Pot's ear and the particular quality of afternoon light through the kitchen window and the sound of the creek at night. She knew she was held when she needed to be, and fed when she was hungry, and that the world, so far, in her experience of it, was essentially warm and essentially present. Elena intended to keep it that way for as long as she had anything to say about it. She knew she wouldn't always have everything to say about it. She knew the world had a way of arriving with its complications regardless of your intentions and your preparations. She had firsthand evidence of that, but she also had firsthand evidence that you could build something strong enough to hold if you built it with the right materials, honesty, and stubbornness, and the willingness to let other people stand beside you instead of insisting on standing alone. She had been bad at that last one. She was getting better. In September, a letter arrived from the regional court. The criminal case against Clyde Harker had concluded. He was convicted on 14 counts of contract fraud, 3 counts of fraudulent land seizure, and 2 counts related to the trafficking of persons under illegal labor contracts. The sentence was significant. He would not be operating in this territory or any adjacent one for a very long time, if ever. His remaining assets, the trading post at Coldwater Crossing, the land holdings he'd accumulated, the various financial instruments Fell's cooperation had helped untangle, were seized and liquidated. The proceeds were directed to a territorial fund for the restoration of wrongfully seized properties, which was not perfect and would not make everyone whole, but was more than most of the people involved had expected to see. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table while Rose sat on the floor investigating a wooden spoon with the focused seriousness of a scholar examining a primary source. Silas was outside. She could hear him at the fence line, a regular sound, the ordinary sound of a morning at the ranch, work being done and things being maintained. She set the letter down. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about Harker's watch chain, the way it caught the light. She hadn't thought about it in months, and she found that when she thought about it now, it was just a thing. Just a piece of metal on a piece of chain, the kind of object that has no power outside of the context that gave it power. That context was gone. She didn't know where the watch chain was now, in some evidence box somewhere, presumably, and she found she didn't need to know. She picked up the letter and went outside. Silas was at the fence, replacing a post that had rotted at the base over the winter. He had the old post out and the new one ready, and he was working with the focused economy of a man who has done this type of thing many times. He looked up when he heard her, and she held the letter out, and he took it and read it with one dirty hand, standing in the morning light with the new fence post leaning against his shoulder. He read it all the way through. Then he folded it and handed it back. "Good," he said. The same word she remembered him not saying back in Coldwater Crossing, or the word she remembered Harker saying, in that mild, satisfied voice, and which now meant something entirely different in Silas's mouth. Not mild, not satisfied, just true. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment and she looked back, and Rose was in the carrier against Elena's chest, making the small sounds of someone who has opinions about the fence post situation, and Pot was sitting in the grass nearby watching everything with his professional, interested attention. Behind them, the ranch spread out in the September morning. The house with its slightly crooked shelves and its 4 chairs, the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to turn, the garden that had done well this year, better than last year, the way gardens do when you start to understand their particular requirements and stop asking them to be something other than what they are. It was not a perfect place. The barn still needed work on the east wall. The road from the ranch to the main track turned to mud in the rain in ways that were inconvenient. There were mornings when Elena woke at 3 and lay in the dark with the old weight of everything, the weight that didn't entirely leave you just because the thing that caused it was over. There were evenings when Silas was quiet in ways she hadn't yet fully learned to read. When something behind his eyes was present that she knew had history in it, she was still learning. They were 2 imperfect people in an imperfect place, building something with their hands and their history and the daily choice, made again each morning, to keep building. Elena looked out at the cottonwoods and the creek and the September sky, and she thought, not for the last time, not in some final conclusive way, but in the plain ordinary way a person thinks a thing that is true, that freedom was not what she had thought it was when she was on the floor of that storage shed and Clyde Harker walked out with her daughter. She had thought of it then as absence, as the removal of chains, as getting from where she was to somewhere else, anywhere else. She understood now that that was only the beginning of it. That was the door. What came after the door was the actual thing, the choosing. Every day, the choosing. Who to stand beside, what to protect, what to build and keep building, even when it was slow, even when it was hard, even when you woke at 3 a.m. with the old weight and had to decide again to set it down and get up and start. Rose made a sound against her chest. Impatient, specific, entirely herself. Elena put her hand on her daughter's back and felt her breathe. "Come on," she said to Silas. "Help me get her inside. She wants breakfast." He put the fence post down and came, and they walked back to the house together across the September grass, and the door opened, and they went in.